What's the worst thing you discovered about yourself online? I was making avocado toast when my mom called me sobbing so hard she could barely breathe. I can't believe you're leaving me forever. I dropped my knife out of confusion. I'm not leaving you, I chuckled back. Yes, you are, she yelled through tears. You're having a wedding in Dubai and you're never coming back. She broke into a loud sob. Mom, I'm not getting married. I'm not going to Dubai. What are actually you talking about? I insisted. Honey, you literally told me last night on the phone. We spoke for an hour about how you're moving to Dubai. I sat there stunned. Last night I had fallen asleep early. It would have been impossible for me to even call her. I told my mom I wasn't going anywhere and hung up to go figure this out. I looked down at my phone, and that's when I noticed the texts from others congratulating me. My bestie had sent me a link saying, "You texted this to me this morning, but I wanted to make sure it's real." I opened the link with shaking hands and saw my full name paired with a man's name I'd never met, and a wedding dated for next Thursday. There were 50 items, all purchased and being shipped to an address in Dubai. I was still processing everything when my doorbell rang. The delivery driver handed me a garment bag with a wedding dress that had my exact size with a receipt showing it was custom ordered 3 weeks prior. More deliveries showed up, handing over a matching jewelry set and luggages with tags leading to the address to Dubai. I searched for the man's name online and found nothing. No social media, no LinkedIn, nothing. It was like he didn't exist. But someone was spending massive amounts of money to make this wedding real. A wedding I wanted no part of. Then I found the answer. I did a reverse image search on my own photos to see if they'd been used somewhere. That's when I found it. American bride seeking traditional husband splashed across a website. Someone was trying to sell me as a mail order bride. I felt my whole body trembling swiping through my profile. There were intimate photos from my Instagram, professional headshots from my LinkedIn, even more private photos from years ago. Photos that only one person had access to, my ex-boyfriend Jerry. I remembered making him delete them after breaking up 2 years ago, but apparently he'd left copies. The rest of the profile had intimate details about my body. Birthmarks, scars, preferences, things only Jerry would know. The bio said I was desperate to escape my boring life and wanted a man who would own me completely. And the seller promised I'd be docile, eager, and trained. Then I saw something that nearly made my heart stop. A shipping date. For tonight. Suddenly I heard the door jiggling. I heard a brass key slowly slip into the keyhole and immediately sprung into action. I grabbed a pepper spray from my nightstand and hid under my bed. I watched from the crack of my door as 3 men walked inside, carefully checking each corner. Delivery, one man said in a mocking tone as they searched every room for me. They entered my room and stopped near my bed. Suddenly, "Boo!" a man said as he pulled the mattress off the bed and grinned at me. I screamed and tried to activate the pepper spray, but the button had gotten stuck. They chuckled. One of them crouched down and grabbed my ankles, pulling me out from underneath. "Time to go, babe," a familiar voice said. I looked up and saw the face of my ex, grinning back at me right as he placed a gag in my mouth and zip-tied my hands together. "Your new owner is waiting." I breathed heavily against the gag, trying to fight back against my panic. They dragged me into a van and drove for an hour until all the lampposts disappeared. The van came to a halt, and Jerry dragged me out and pushed me onto the cement floor of a private airport somewhere clearly outside the city. He removed the gag and I immediately screamed for help, but this only made him laugh. "No one around here for miles, sweetheart." I glared at him. "You're trafficking me? You're selling me like I'm property?" His face twisted into that smile I used to fear. "You left me, told everyone that I hurt you. I mean, it was true, but that was our secret. But I knew you loved it, being a little toy. So now you get to be a rich man's toy in Dubai." I couldn't believe what I was hearing. "You're actually insane," I told him. "No, I'm rich. And you're cargo." He nodded to the men. "Get her ready." The men placed the gag back on and placed a pretty little wedding veil on my head. I screamed and fought against their grip, but it was too late. A plane from Dubai landed and more than a dozen armed men stepped out. I watched a well-dressed Middle Eastern man step out in an expensive suit with ruby rings on each hand. "Finally! She's all yours, just like we discussed. I've got her documents right here." Jerry grinned. But the man looked at Jerry with a disgusted expression and pulled out a badge. FBI. More agents swarmed from behind the plane and from vehicles I hadn't even noticed parked in the darkness. They moved fast, shouting commands as they surrounded Jerry and his 3 accomplices. Jerry's face went from confused to furious as 2 agents grabbed his arms and forced them behind his back. The metallic click of handcuffs echoed across the empty runway. His buddies tried to run, but agents tackled them within seconds, pressing them face down on the cement. A woman with short dark hair approached me slowly, her hands visible and empty. She crouched down to my eye level and her voice came out steady and calm. "I'm Maxine. You're safe now. No one is going to hurt you." Her fingers worked carefully at the gag, pulling it away from my mouth, and I gasped in a huge breath of air. She pulled out a small knife and I flinched hard, but she just cut through the zip ties on my wrists, being so gentle that the blade never touched my skin. My hands dropped free and I immediately started rubbing at the deep red marks circling both wrists. I couldn't process what was happening. This was supposed to be the worst moment of my life, and instead federal agents were here. Maxine stayed close, not touching me but present, while other agents secured the scene around us. Jerry was screaming something, but an agent pushed his head down as they walked him toward a black SUV. The other agents wrapped a thick blanket around my shoulders and guided me to my feet. My legs felt like jelly, and I stumbled, but someone caught my elbow to steady me. We walked away from where Jerry stood near the SUV, still shouting. I could hear fragments of his words. Threats about how I'd regret this, and how I was his. Maxine positioned herself between me and Jerry's voice, blocking my view of him. We stopped near a different vehicle and she turned to face me fully. We've been tracking this trafficking ring for 6 months, she explained. Her words came out matter-of-fact but not cold. Your ex-boyfriend's attempt to sell you tonight was the break we needed to make arrests and shut down the whole operation. I just stared at her. 6 months. They'd known about this for 6 months. I opened my mouth to ask why they didn't warn me, but the words wouldn't come out. An agent opened the door to an SUV and helped me climb into the back seat. Maxine got in beside me and we drove away from the airport. I watched through the rear window as Jerry was loaded into a separate vehicle, his face pressed against the glass, still trying to yell. The blanket felt scratchy against my neck, but I pulled it tighter anyway. We drove for maybe 20 minutes before pulling up to a building that looked like a regular office complex except for the security gate and armed guards. Inside, the fluorescent lights made everything feel too bright and too real. A woman in scrubs met us in a hallway and introduced herself as a medical examiner. She led me into a small room with an exam table and cabinets full of supplies. She asked if I was okay with her documenting my injuries, and I nodded because what else was I supposed to do? Her gloved hands lifted my wrists one at a time, taking photos of the marks from the zip ties. She measured them with a ruler and wrote notes on a tablet. She asked me to remove my shirt so she could check for other injuries, and I complied robotically, standing there in my bra while she photographed bruises on my arms from where Jerry's guys had grabbed me. Everything felt completely surreal. My brain kept trying to catch up with the fact that I wasn't on a plane to Dubai right now. I wasn't being sold. I was in a hospital room with an FBI medical examiner taking pictures of my wrists. My hands wouldn't stop shaking no matter how hard I tried to control them. The examiner noticed and brought me a cup of water, telling me the shaking was a normal response to trauma. She finished her documentation and told me I could put my shirt back on. Maxine was waiting outside the exam room and she introduced me to a man standing beside her. This is Gareth, she said. He had kind eyes and a gentle smile that didn't feel forced or fake. Gareth explained that he was a victim advocate, and his job was to help me navigate everything that came next. He said there was no pressure and no judgment, just support for whatever I needed. We walked to a small office with comfortable chairs and he sat across from me, not behind a desk like some authority figure. For the first time in hours, someone was actually listening to what I needed instead of just moving me from place to place like cargo. He asked what would help me feel safe right now, and I almost cried, because no one had asked me that question. I told him I needed to call my mom and let her know I was okay. Gareth pulled out a secure phone and handed it to me, giving me privacy by stepping into the hallway. Mom answered on the first ring, her voice frantic. I told her I was safe, and with the FBI and her relief poured through the phone, so loud I had to hold it away from my ear. She said she was getting in the car right now to drive here. I could hear her grabbing her keys in the background. Gareth came back in and I handed him the phone and he talked to Mom in this calm way that somehow convinced her I needed a few hours to get checked out and give my statement before she arrived. They arranged for her to come in the morning and Mom made me promise 3 times that I was really okay before she hung up. It was around 2 a.m. when Maxine came back and asked if I was ready to give a brief initial interview. She emphasized that we'd focus just on tonight's events and not dig into the whole history with Jerry yet. I sat in a different room with a recording device on the table between us. Maxine asked me to describe what happened starting from when I heard my door being opened. I told her about hiding under the bed, about Jerry and his guys finding me, about the gag and zip ties and the van ride. My voice stayed surprisingly steady until I got to the part where Jerry explained he was selling me like property. Then I had to stop and take a few breaths. Maxine waited patiently and didn't rush me. I described Jerry's words at the airport, how he said I was cargo and that my new owner was waiting. She recorded everything and reassured me we could fill in more details later when I was rested. After the interview, Gareth explained that going home wasn't safe tonight since Jerry still had a key to my apartment. He'd arranged for me to stay at a victim services safe house instead. A female agent drove me there in an unmarked car. The safe house was a small apartment in a regular-looking building. The agent showed me the security features, including cameras at the door, reinforced locks, and a panic button by the bed that connected directly to police dispatch. She made sure I knew how everything worked before she left. I was finally alone in the small but clean bedroom. The bed had fresh sheets, and there were basic toiletries in the bathroom. I sat on the edge of the mattress, and that's when I finally let myself cry. Big, ugly sobs that shook my whole body. I cried for what felt like hours until I had no tears left. I tried to sleep, but it was impossible. Every time I started to drift off, I jerked awake, convinced I heard footsteps or doors opening. My heart would race, and I'd lie there in the dark, listening hard to every tiny sound the building made. I probably woke up every hour. When morning light finally started coming through the window, I felt this weird mix of grateful to be alive and scared about what happened next with the legal case and my privacy that Jerry had violated so completely. Mom arrived at exactly 9 a.m. Gareth met us in a family room at the FBI office, and the second I saw her face, I started crying again. She wrapped me in the tightest hug of my life, and we both stood there with tears streaming down our faces. Gareth quietly left the room to give us privacy. Mom pulled back to look at me, her hands on my shoulders, checking me over like she could see if I was really okay. Then she started oscillating between being relieved I was safe, being furious at Jerry, and feeling guilty that she didn't protect me from him 2 years ago when we first broke up. She kept saying she should have known. She should have done more. She should have made sure he was really out of my life. I let her talk for a few minutes, but then I had to stop her. I told her as gently as I could that her guilt wasn't helpful right now. What I needed was her support without the spiral of self-blame. Mom took a shaky breath and her face crumpled a little, but then she nodded. She asked me what she could actually do to help, and I felt this small shift happen between us. We were going to be a team in this, instead of her trying to rescue me like I was still a kid. Gareth knocked softly and came back into the room a few minutes later with Maxine right behind him. She sat down across from us and opened a folder on the table. Maxine explained that Jerry and his 3 guys were being held without bail while they waited for their court date. The charges were federal kidnapping and human trafficking, because they took me across state lines to that airport and planned to send me to another country. She said federal cases like this came with serious jail time, like mandatory minimums of 15 years or more if they got convicted. The words felt heavy but also kind of relieving because it meant Jerry wasn't getting out anytime soon. Mom squeezed my hand as Maxine went through all the legal details. After Maxine left, a woman named Rhoda came in carrying a laptop bag and some equipment. She worked in the FBI cyber forensics team and needed to make copies of everything on my phone and laptop. Rhoda explained they had to document the fake wedding website, all those texts Jerry sent pretending to be me, and that horrible profile he made. I handed over my phone first and watched her connect it to some device with cables. My stomach twisted knowing she was going to see those private photos Jerry had stolen. Rhoda must have noticed my face because she promised they would only look at what they legally needed for the case. She said everything would be handled professionally and kept secure. I gave her my laptop too, even though it felt like handing over pieces of myself. The whole process took about 40 minutes while Rhoda worked quietly, and I sat there feeling exposed all over again. When she finished, she gave me back my devices and a receipt showing what they had copied. Gareth suggested we take a break, but there was more to do. He pulled out a stack of forms and explained we needed to start the protective order process right away. This would legally stop Jerry and his guys from contacting me in any way. We sat at the table and Gareth walked me through each section. I had to write about my relationship with Jerry, how we dated 2 years ago, how he hurt me back then. My hands started shaking as I filled in details about the emotional abuse, the way he controlled me, how scared I was when we were together. Then I had to describe last night, the kidnapping, being dragged to that airport. Writing it all down made it feel real again in a way that talking about it hadn't. Each page I signed felt heavier than the last. Gareth stayed patient the whole time, not rushing me when I needed to stop and breathe. After we finished the protective order paperwork, a woman in a sharp suit came in and introduced herself as Alina Romano. She was the assistant prosecutor who would be handling Jerry's case. Alina sat down and laid out a timeline on the table showing how the next few weeks and months would go. She explained about grand jury testimony where I would have to tell my story to regular people who would decide if there was enough evidence. She talked about potential trial dates and the possibility that Jerry might try to make a deal to avoid going to trial. I liked that she didn't pretend this would be easy or quick. She was direct but not mean about it, just honest about how hard the legal process could be. Alina said she would keep me informed every step of the way, and that I could call her office anytime with questions. Somewhere in the middle of all this legal talk, my brain suddenly remembered work. I hadn't been to my job in 2 days and my boss had no idea where I was. Panic shot through me as I imagined getting fired on top of everything else. Gareth noticed me freaking out and asked what was wrong. I explained about work and he immediately helped me pull out my phone to draft an email. We kept it short and simple, just saying I was the victim of a crime and was working with law enforcement. My finger hovered over the send button for a second before I pressed it. My boss wrote back within 5 minutes saying she was so sorry and that I should take whatever time I needed. The relief only lasted a moment before a new worry hit me. I couldn't afford to miss more than a week of work without serious money problems. My rent was due in 2 weeks and I had barely any savings. The fear must have shown on my face because Gareth started explaining something called victim compensation funds. He said these funds could help cover lost wages and therapy costs for people who went through crimes like this. We started filling out another application, even though he warned me it could take weeks to get approved. I tried not to think about how I would pay my bills while waiting. By late afternoon, my brain felt like mush from all the paperwork and questions. Maxine came back to check on us and suggested we call it a day so I could rest. Mom immediately said I should come stay with her, that she lived only 2 hours away and had plenty of room. But I wasn't ready to leave the city where my job was, where my whole life was. We went back and forth for a bit until we agreed on a compromise where Mom would stay at a hotel nearby for the next few days. That evening, Mom and I sat in her hotel room with takeout containers spread across the bed. We tried to talk about normal stuff like her garden and my coworker's new baby. It almost worked until Mom suddenly put down her food and started crying again. She said she was scared to let me out of her sight, that she kept imagining what could have happened if the FBI hadn't been there. I had to remind her that agents were watching my location and that I had the panic button from the safe house. She nodded and wiped her eyes, but I could tell she was still terrified. We finished eating in quieter conversation, and I left around 9 to go back to the safe house. The next morning, my phone rang while I was trying to force down some toast. It was Alina calling with news about the court hearing. Jerry had shown up and said he wasn't guilty. His lawyer tried to argue that he should get bail, that he wasn't dangerous. But the judge heard about the kidnapping and how Jerry had planned to send me to another country. The judge said no to bail and Jerry would stay locked up until trial. I felt my first real full breath since this whole thing started. Knowing he was staying behind bars made the world feel a tiny bit safer. Later that afternoon, Gareth took me to meet a therapist he knew. Her name was Maggie, and she worked with people who had been through partner violence and trafficking situations. Maggie's office was in a quiet building with comfortable chairs and soft lighting. Our first meeting was just her getting to know me and asking basic questions about what I was dealing with. She explained how therapy might help with the nightmares I was already having, and the way I jumped at every sound. Maggie said we would work at my pace and I could stop anytime I needed to. When I left her office an hour later, I felt something I hadn't felt in days. Maybe I wasn't going to be broken forever. The next day, Mom picked me up from the safe house and we drove to my apartment with a locksmith following behind us in his van. My hands shook as I unlocked the door and stepped inside for the first time since Jerry had dragged me out. Everything looked normal but felt wrong, like someone had moved through my space and left invisible fingerprints everywhere. The locksmith got to work on the front door while Mom and I started checking every room. We looked behind curtains, under furniture, inside closet corners, searching for cameras or recording devices Jerry might have planted. I pulled out my phone and used the flashlight to check air vents and smoke detectors. Mom opened every drawer in my bedroom dresser, running her hands along the bottoms to feel for anything taped underneath. We found nothing, but the search took over an hour because we had to be sure. The locksmith finished installing new deadbolts on both the front door and the bedroom door, then handed me 3 copies of each key. I paid him in cash and watched through the window as he drove away. Then I walked to my living room where the wedding dress and veil still hung on the coat rack where I'd left them days ago. The white fabric looked dirty now, wrinkled from being shoved in evidence bags and then returned to me. I grabbed both items and carried them to the kitchen trash can. Mom asked if I wanted to keep them as proof or evidence, but Gareth had already told me the FBI had plenty of photos. I shoved the dress down into the garbage bag, pushing hard to make it fit, then placed the veil on top. Mom tied the bag closed and we carried it down to the dumpster outside. My phone rang while we were walking back upstairs. I didn't recognize the number but answered anyway. A man's voice asked if I was willing to comment on the trafficking case involving a local woman. My stomach dropped. He answered on the second ring and I explained what just happened. He asked me to forward him the number, then told me he'd help me get a new phone number today. We met him at the phone store an hour later and I filled out paperwork to change my number. The employee asked if I wanted to keep my old number active for a few days to catch important calls, but Gareth explained that wasn't an option in my situation. The new number activated within 20 minutes. I sent text to my boss and my 2 closest friends with the update, asking them not to share it with anyone. Gareth reminded me I had zero obligation to talk to any reporters or media about what happened. He said victim privacy laws should have protected my information, but sometimes details leak anyway. Mom decided to stay at my apartment instead of going back to her hotel. She set up camp on my couch with her overnight bag, and immediately started acting like a security guard. Every hour she'd walk through the apartment checking locks and windows. She jumped at every sound from the hallway, every door closing in a neighbor's unit, every car alarm in the parking lot. By the evening of day 3, I felt like I couldn't breathe in my own home. She was standing at my bedroom door for the 5th time that day, asking if I was okay, if I needed anything, if I felt safe. I sat on my bed and took a breath before speaking. I told her I knew she was trying to help, but I needed some space to process everything on my own terms. Her face crumpled and she started apologizing, saying she just couldn't stop worrying. I explained that her constant checking was making me more anxious, not less, because it reminded me every hour that something terrible had happened. We talked for 20 minutes about finding a balance where she could still be supportive without hovering over me. She agreed to go back to her hotel the next morning, but made me promise to call her twice a day and use our code word if anything felt wrong. My phone rang again the following afternoon while I was trying to work from home. Maxine's name showed up on the screen. She said the FBI had been analyzing Jerry's contacts and financial records. They'd found evidence that his trafficking operation was bigger than just my case. There were communications with at least 4 other men who seemed to be running similar schemes in different cities. She asked if I'd be willing to help with the larger investigation by looking at photos of potential victims, or providing information about Jerry's friends and associates from when we dated. I felt my chest tighten at the thought of taking on more than just my own case. I told Maxine I needed time to think about it. She said that was completely reasonable and there was no pressure, but my cooperation could help identify other women who might be in danger. We ended the call and I sat staring at my laptop screen for 10 minutes without moving. I had my therapy appointment with Maggie that Thursday. She asked how I was managing the return to my apartment, and I told her about Mom's hovering and the reporter's call. Then we started talking about my relationship with Jerry 2 years ago. Maggie explained that what he'd done to me during our relationship was something called coercive control. She described how abusers isolate their partners from friends and family, monitor their phones and social media, make them feel crazy for questioning suspicious behavior. I realized Jerry had done all of those things. He'd convinced me my friends were jealous of our relationship. He'd asked for my phone password saying couples shouldn't have secrets. He'd made me doubt my own memory when I caught him in lies, telling me I was being paranoid and dramatic. Maggie helped me see patterns I couldn't recognize while I was living through them. The session left me feeling exhausted, but also validated. Like my instincts back then had been right even when Jerry made me think I was wrong. That night, I was lying in bed trying to fall asleep when a memory hit me hard. Jerry taking photos of a birthmark on my lower back during one of our last weekends together. He'd said it was beautiful, that he wanted to remember every detail of my body. I'd felt flattered at the time. Now I understood he was cataloging my physical features for that trafficking profile. He'd been planning this for months, maybe even before we broke up. The realization made me run to the bathroom where I threw up everything I'd eaten for dinner. I sat on the cold tile floor shaking, understanding how long he'd been preparing to sell me like property. The protective order hearing happened the next Tuesday. I didn't have to go to the courthouse because it was a video hearing. Jerry appeared on a screen from the jail, wearing an orange jumpsuit with his hands cuffed in front of him. His lawyer argued the protective order was unnecessary since Jerry was already locked up and couldn't contact me anyway. The judge listened to both sides, then looked directly at the camera. She said the order would be permanent and enforceable even after any potential release from custody. Jerry's face on that screen twisted with anger, and I felt glad I was watching from Gareth's office instead of sitting in the same courtroom. Seeing his reaction reminded me exactly why I was fighting this case. 2 days later, a security company came to install cameras and sensors at my apartment. The installation guy was patient while I asked about a million questions. How sensitive were the motion sensors? What happened if someone tried to break in? Could I monitor everything from my phone? Would the alarm work if my internet went out? He answered each question carefully and showed me how to arm and disarm the system. When he finished, I had cameras pointing at both my front door and the sliding door to my balcony, plus motion sensors on every window. Having that control over my own space helped me sleep a little better that night. The next afternoon, my doorbell rang and my whole body went cold. I checked the camera feed on my phone and saw a delivery driver holding a large flower arrangement. I almost didn't answer, but then I saw the card was from my coworkers. The driver handed me the flowers and I carried them inside, reading the supportive messages on the card. But then panic hit me. How did my coworkers know my address? How did the flower shop find me? Someone had tracked down where I lived even after I'd been so careful. My breathing got faster and faster until I was gasping. I called Gareth and he talked me through it while I sat on my kitchen floor. He reminded me that my coworkers probably got my address from HR records, that this was a kind gesture, that the security system would alert me to any real threats. Then he helped me set up a P.O. box at the post office for any future deliveries. After we hung up, I was still shaking and exhausted from the panic attack. I called Maggie even though it wasn't our regular appointment day. She answered and immediately switched into therapist mode. She walked me through grounding techniques, having me name 5 things I could see in my apartment. I said couch, coffee table, TV, bookshelf, window. Then 4 things I could touch. I pressed my hand against the cold floor, ran my fingers over the couch fabric, picked up a throw pillow, touched the smooth surface of my phone screen. My breathing started to slow down. Maggie kept talking in that calm voice, helping me reconnect with the present moment instead of spiraling into fear about what might happen. By the time we finished the call 20 minutes later, I felt steady enough to stand up and make myself tea. 2 days later, Rhoda called while I was sorting through mail at my apartment. Her voice sounded excited as she explained they had traced IP addresses from the trafficking website back to Jerry's apartment, and also to an address belonging to one of his guys who helped grab me. The digital fingerprints showed multiple logins from both locations over several weeks, building timestamps that proved Jerry had been planning this for a long time. I felt something loosen in my chest, knowing they had concrete proof beyond just my word against his. Rhoda walked me through how the evidence worked, explaining server logs and metadata in simple terms, and by the time we hung up, I felt like the case was becoming real and solid instead of just my traumatic memory. The next afternoon, Alina asked me to come to her office at the courthouse. She spread out financial documents across her desk and explained that the FBI had gotten court orders for payment processors to track money Jerry received. My hands went cold as she showed me a wire transfer for $45,000 sent as a deposit for delivering me to Dubai. The number sat there on the page like a price tag on my body. Alina kept talking about how this financial trail would be crucial for proving human trafficking charges, since it showed Jerry was treating me as property for sale. I nodded along but couldn't stop staring at that number, wondering what made me worth exactly that amount to some stranger overseas. She noticed my face and gently closed the folder, reminding me that the money proved Jerry's crime, not my value as a person. That evening, I was going through my phone trying to figure out how Jerry got some of the more private photos, when I realized something that made me want to throw up. Some of the intimate pictures he used were ones I had stored in my cloud account years ago. I remembered using the same password for everything back then, and Jerry definitely knew it from when we were together. He must have logged into my cloud storage long after we broke up and downloaded everything private I had saved there. The violation felt different from the kidnapping somehow, like he had been inside my digital life for months or years without me knowing. I called Maggie even though it was past normal therapy hours, and she answered immediately. Through my shaky explanation, she helped me see that this was his criminal behavior. his choice to violate my privacy and my trust. It wasn't my fault for using a weak password or storing photos in the cloud like millions of people do every day. The next morning, Gareth showed up at my apartment with his laptop and a patient smile. He spent 3 hours walking me through changing every single password I had for email, social media, banking, shopping sites, everything. We set up two-factor authentication, so even if someone got my password, they would need my phone to actually log in. Then he helped me create a safety plan that included code words with Mom and my coworkers, so I could signal if I ever felt unsafe. The code word with Mom was pineapple because we both hate pineapple on pizza and would never say it in normal conversation. With my work friends, we picked Lighthouse because none of us had ever been to one. Having these practical steps made me feel less powerless, like I was taking back control over my own security. 3 days later, Mom called me crying so hard I could barely understand her words. Someone had shown up at her house claiming to be a journalist writing a story about trafficking survivors. The person asked invasive questions about me and our family and took photos of her house before she could get the door closed. Mom was terrified and furious and kept apologizing for not protecting me better. I drove the 2 hours to her place and we went straight to the police station to file a harassment report. The officer who took our statement was sympathetic and contacted the prosecutor's office right away. By that afternoon, Alina had filed paperwork to expand the protective order to include Mom's address with the same 500-foot restriction. Sitting in Mom's living room afterward, I felt horrible that my situation was now putting her in danger too, but she squeezed my hand and told me we were in this together. A week later, Alina scheduled a meeting to prepare me for grand jury testimony. She explained that I would have to go into a room with about 20 regular citizens and describe the kidnapping in detail so they could decide if there was enough evidence to formally indict Jerry and his guys. The thought of telling that story to a room full of strangers made my stomach turn over. Alina was patient as she walked me through what questions the prosecutor would ask and how I should answer clearly and honestly. She reminded me that the grand jury was on my side, that they were there to determine if a crime occurred, not to judge me. But knowing I would have to relive that night out loud in front of people made me feel sick and shaky. That same week, I got a notification that someone had tagged me in a post. I opened it and saw a fake account using my photos and my full name. The profile had been created just days earlier and was posting lies about how I was a willing participant in some kind of relationship arrangement and got cold feet at the last minute. The post made me sound unstable and attention-seeking. I scrolled through growing panic as I saw the fake account had tagged my real friends and coworkers in these lies. This was clearly designed to make people doubt me before the trial. I screenshot everything with shaking hands and sent it all to Maxine. She called me back within an hour and said her team was already working to get the accounts taken down and documenting everything as evidence of witness intimidation. But the damage felt done as I imagined people I knew reading those lies and wondering if they were true. The harassment and constant stress started breaking me down over the following days. I lay awake at night thinking about asking Alina to just drop the charges so I could try to move on with my life. The idea of months more of this felt impossible. But then I remembered what Maxine had said about the FBI finding evidence of other women Jerry had targeted. If I backed out now, would he eventually get another chance to do this to someone else? Could I live with knowing I had let him off easy? The weight of that responsibility felt crushing, but I knew I couldn't let other potential victims down just because I was tired of fighting. I called Alina and told her I needed clear boundaries about what was required versus optional in this whole process. She listened without judgment as I explained I was committed to cooperating fully with the prosecution, but I needed to feel like I had some control over my own involvement. We spent an hour on the phone creating a plan where she would keep me informed of all developments, but wouldn't pressure me to participate in anything beyond the legally necessary testimony. She would ask before including me in any optional meetings or procedures. Having that agreement helped me feel less like a pawn being moved around a chessboard by the legal system. 2 weeks later, Maxine called with an unusual request. The FBI wanted me to make a recorded phone call to Jerry in jail. The hope was that he might make statements that would help their case if he thought I was alone and scared and might forgive him. My whole body went cold at the thought of hearing his voice again. But Maxine promised I would be in a secure room at the FBI office with agents monitoring everything, and I could hang up at any second if I felt unsafe. She explained how important it could be to get him on tape showing his mindset and lack of remorse. I agreed even though every part of me wanted to refuse. The next morning, I sat in a small windowless room at the FBI office with Maxine and 2 other agents. They had recording equipment set up and a phone on speaker. Maxine dialed the jail, and after several transfers and holds, Jerry's voice came through the speaker. My heart pounded so hard I thought it might break through my ribs. He sounded surprised but pleased to hear from me, immediately launching into how he knew I would come around and understand that he was just trying to give me a better life. His arrogant assumption that I would forgive him made me want to scream, but I kept my voice steady and let him talk. He said things about how we belonged together and how the FBI had ruined his plan to make us both rich. Every word was captured on tape, his complete lack of remorse and his twisted justification for trying to sell me. When I finally hung up 15 minutes later, I was shaking, but also felt a strange sense of victory knowing his own words would help convict him. 2 days later, Rhoda called me into a conference room at the FBI office and spread printed bank statements across the table. She pointed to highlighted wire transfers with her pen and explained that Jerry had received $45,000 from an overseas account as partial payment for delivering me. The money came through 3 separate transfers over 2 weeks to make it look less suspicious. My stomach turned as I stared at the numbers representing what someone thought I was worth. Rhoda traced the account back through several shell companies to a known human trafficking network operating across 6 countries. This wasn't just Jerry being a sick ex-boyfriend anymore. This was part of an actual organized crime operation that bought and sold women-like products. The case had officially transformed from a domestic incident into an international trafficking investigation. Maxine joined us and laid out photos of financial documents connecting Jerry's payments to at least 4 other similar transactions in the past year. Other women had been sold through this same network, and Jerry had been working with them for months before he targeted me. Maxine explained they were planning a coordinated operation to arrest Jerry's associate, who had helped set up the fake wedding registry and trafficking profile. Multiple agencies were involved, including Interpol, since the network crossed international borders. She promised I wouldn't be anywhere near the arrest, and they had enough evidence now that my testimony was just one piece of a much bigger case. Knowing they were dismantling the whole network instead of just punishing Jerry made me feel like this nightmare might actually lead to something good. Maybe other women would be saved because I had survived and cooperated. Maxine showed me surveillance photos of the associate, a thin man with glasses who ran a web design business as his cover. He had created profiles for at least 8 women, including mine, and the FBI had been watching him for weeks, waiting for the right moment to move in. The judge held another hearing 3 days later, and I sat in the courtroom while Alina presented evidence of the social media harassment and the attempt to contact my mom. Someone had created 5 fake accounts using variations of my name and posted lies about me being a willing participant who got scared. The accounts tagged my employer, my friends, and even my mom's church group. The judge's face got hard as she reviewed printouts of the posts and messages. She granted a more robust protective order that now included electronic communication prohibitions. Jerry and his accomplices were banned from contacting me through any social media, email, phone, or third party. The order also established a 500-foot distance requirement if Jerry ever made bail. These legal protections felt like a shield even if they were just paper. At least now, if he violated them, he would face immediate arrest and additional charges. I got home from the courthouse and found a message from Alina on my phone. Jerry's bail had been completely revoked. Prosecutors had presented evidence that he tried to have another inmate pass messages to his accomplices on the outside. The messages included instructions to delete evidence and intimidate potential witnesses. The judge was furious that he was trying to obstruct justice from inside jail. He got remanded to federal detention until trial with no possibility of release. Alina called me personally 20 minutes later to make sure I got the news because she knew how much anxiety I had about the possibility of him getting out. Her voice sounded genuinely happy as she told me Jerry would be staying locked up. I thanked her and hung up, feeling like I could finally breathe a little easier. He couldn't hurt me from a federal detention cell. Gareth showed up at my apartment the next afternoon carrying a large plastic evidence bag. Inside were the wedding dress and veil that had been held as evidence for weeks. They had been photographed and documented, so thoroughly that the FBI was releasing them back to me. I stared at the white fabric through the clear plastic and felt sick. Gareth asked what I wanted to do with them. Throwing them in the trash felt wrong somehow, like they would still exist somewhere. I told him I wanted to burn them. He nodded and helped me carry the bag to his car. We drove 2 hours to Mom's house where she had a fire pit in the backyard. Mom came outside when we arrived and immediately understood what we were doing. She grabbed lighter fluid from the garage without me having to explain. I pulled the dress and veil out of the bag and laid them in the metal fire pit. The white fabric looked so innocent and pretty lying there. Mom handed me the lighter fluid and I soaked the material until it was dripping. Gareth gave me matches and stepped back. I lit the first match and dropped it onto the dress. The flames caught immediately and spread across the fabric in orange and blue waves. The veil curled and blackened as it burned. I watched those symbols of Jerry's plan turn to ash and felt something shift inside me. This was my story to control now, not his. I had a session with Maggie 2 days later, and we spent the hour exploring the difference between Jerry's coercive control and genuine care from people like Mom and Gareth. Maggie asked me to describe how Jerry used to check on me when we were dating. I remembered how he would text me every hour asking where I was and who I was with. If I didn't respond fast enough, he would show up wherever I was to make sure I was okay. At the time, I thought it meant he cared about me. Maggie helped me see that real care respects choices and boundaries instead of trying to control them. Mom calls me regularly now, but she doesn't freak out if I don't answer right away. Gareth checks in to see if I need anything, but he doesn't demand to know my schedule. The distinction seemed obvious once Maggie pointed it out, but I had been so confused for so long about what healthy support looked like. Learning to recognize the difference helped me trust the people actually trying to help instead of pushing everyone away. I met with HR at work the following Monday to discuss taking FMLA leave for trauma therapy. My boss Lisa sat in on the meeting to help me navigate the paperwork. I explained I needed protected leave to attend weekly therapy sessions and possibly some court dates. Lisa immediately said my job would be waiting for me, and she would make sure I had whatever flexibility I needed. HR walked me through the victim compensation options for lost wages if I needed to miss work for legal proceedings. There were forms to fill out and documentation to gather, But knowing my job was protected while I focused on healing removed one major source of stress. Lisa told me the whole office was rooting for me, even though most of them didn't know the details. She said I could share as much or as little as I wanted, and they would support me either way. I left that meeting feeling grateful that at least one part of my life was stable. The grand jury testimony happened on a Tuesday morning in early November. I wore a navy blue dress and drove to the courthouse with Gareth. My hands shook as we walked through security and up to the third floor. Alina met us outside the grand jury room and went over what would happen. I would go in alone and answer questions from the prosecutor while the jurors listened. They could ask questions too if they wanted. No one was there to defend Jerry or cross-examine me. This was just about whether there was enough evidence to formally indict him. I walked into the room and 23 people sat in chairs arranged in a semicircle. The prosecutor asked me to describe finding the fake wedding registry. I told them about my mom's phone call and the deliveries and searching my photos online. Then I described the abduction from my apartment, the zip ties and gag, the van ride to the airport. I explained what Jerry said about selling me and how the FBI agents had been posing as buyers. The jurors' faces showed shock and sympathy as I talked. Some of the women looked angry. When I described Jerry putting the wedding veil on my head, one juror actually gasped. I finished my testimony and walked out feeling shaky but proud that I had gotten through it without breaking down. Within 2 hours, Alina texted me that the grand jury had returned indictments on all charges, including kidnapping, human trafficking, and conspiracy. I was still processing my relief about the indictments when Alina called that evening with new information. She said there was something I needed to know about the case. One of the buyers Jerry had been negotiating with was actually an FBI asset working undercover. The well-dressed man who stepped off the plane at the airport with the badge wasn't just an agent. He had been posing as a wealthy buyer from Dubai for months, communicating with Jerry and building the case. The realization that the danger was even more real than I knew sent me spiraling. How many of the people in this whole situation had been genuine versus playing a role? Was anyone actually who they said they were? I spent that night unable to sleep, going over every interaction and wondering who else might have been part of the operation without telling me. Maxine showed up at my apartment the next morning without calling first. She sat down on my couch and apologized for not being able to tell me earlier about the undercover operation. She explained that the asset's fake interest in buying me was what allowed them to build the case and time the arrest perfectly. If Jerry had known it was a setup, he would have disappeared and possibly hurt me to keep me quiet. The undercover work was necessary to save my life and catch him in the act. Maxine showed me reports proving the asset had been working trafficking cases for years and had helped rescue dozens of women. She helped me understand that while the deception felt awful, it was the only way to guarantee my safety and build an airtight case. I was still processing everything, but I could see the operation had been carefully planned to protect me even if it meant keeping me in the dark. Maxine promised that from now on she would tell me everything she legally could so I wouldn't feel blindsided again. 2 days later, Maxine called with news that made my stomach turn. They had arrested one of Jerry's associates during a raid on a storage unit across town. I sat on my couch gripping my phone as she described what they found inside. Wedding dresses in different sizes, fake passports and birth certificates, travel documents for flights to Dubai, Morocco, and Turkey. But the worst part was the files. 3 other women had folders with their photos, personal details, and shipping dates. I wasn't special or unique in Jerry's sick plan. I was just one product in his inventory. Maxine asked if I would be willing to speak with the other survivors once they were located and informed. I said yes without thinking because the idea of 3 other women going through this nightmare alone made me feel sick. She promised to arrange it carefully through victim services so no one felt pressured. I hung up and sat there shaking, trying to process that Jerry had been building a whole operation, and I just happened to be the one who got caught in time. The relief that I was safe mixed with guilt, that I didn't somehow prevent this sooner, even though logically I knew that was impossible. My phone rang again that evening and I answered without checking the number. A man's voice asked if I was willing to comment on my experience as a trafficking victim. I froze. He said my initials had been published in a news article that morning along with details about the case. I hung up immediately and searched online with shaking hands. There it was. My initials, my age, my city. The article described the airport arrest and Jerry's trafficking scheme. Comments below speculated about my identity, and some people were already trying to figure out my full name. I called Gareth in a panic, and he arrived at my apartment within 20 minutes. He read through the article and explained that despite laws protecting victim privacy, reporters sometimes got information through court filings or law enforcement leaks. He made calls while I paced my living room, and within an hour, he had arranged for me to stay at Mom's house 2 hours away until the media attention died down. I was furious. Even with protective orders and FBI protection and every legal shield possible, I still couldn't feel safe in my own home. Jerry had violated me, and now I was the one running and hiding while he sat in a jail cell with 3 meals a day and a roof over his head. Mom arrived the next morning to pick me up, and I threw clothes into a bag without really paying attention to what I grabbed. The drive felt endless. I stared out the window watching highway signs blur past and tried to hold myself together. But somewhere around mile 30, I just broke. Tears poured down my face, and I started sobbing so hard I could barely breathe. Mom reached over and grabbed my hand without saying anything. I cried about how unfair everything was. Jerry had planned to sell me like property, and now I was the one who had to keep moving and hiding and changing my phone number. I was the one dealing with reporters and panic attacks and nightmares. He had done this to me, and I was paying the price while he just sat in jail waiting for trial. Mom didn't try to fix it or tell me it would be okay. She just squeezed my hand and let me be angry. She didn't offer advice or platitudes about staying strong. She just drove and held my hand and let me fall apart. That simple acceptance helped more than any words could have. By the time we pulled into her driveway, my face was swollen and my eyes were red, but I felt like I had released something that had been building up for weeks. Mom led me inside and up the stairs to my old bedroom. I stopped in the doorway and stared. She had turned it into a fortress. New locks on the door and window. Thick blackout curtains that blocked out every bit of light. A panic button mounted on the wall next to the bed that she explained connected directly to local police dispatch. My old desk was gone and replaced with a small camera monitor showing views of the driveway and back door. I used to get annoyed by her overprotective tendencies, but now I understood this was her way of coping with feeling helpless. She couldn't stop Jerry from trying to traffic me, but she could make sure I felt safe in her house. We sat on my old bed and talked honestly for the first time about how we were both dealing with trauma from what Jerry did. She admitted she barely slept anymore and jumped at every unexpected sound. I told her about the nightmares and hypervigilance. We cried together, and it felt like we were finally on the same team instead of her trying to rescue me while I pushed her away. She promised to respect my boundaries, and I promised to tell her when I needed help instead of pretending I was fine. 3 days into staying at Mom's house, Alina called with an update. Jerry's defense attorney had reached out about plea negotiations. They wanted to avoid trial, and were proposing a deal where Jerry would plead guilty to reduced charges in exchange for a long prison sentence and cooperation with the broader trafficking investigation. Alina explained the proposed terms carefully. Jerry would admit to federal kidnapping and conspiracy charges, but some of the more serious trafficking counts would be dropped. In exchange, he would get 15 to 20 years and have to cooperate in identifying other network members. I had mixed feelings sitting there on Mom's couch listening to her explain it. Part of me wanted my day in court. I wanted to face Jerry in front of a jury and tell them everything he did. But another part of me was terrified of trial, of being cross-examined by his lawyer, of having every detail of our relationship picked apart in public, of the possibility that a jury might not believe me or might acquit him on some charges. Alina said I should think about it and we could discuss more later. I told her I needed to be involved in any plea discussions because this was my life and my justice, not just another case file. We set up a conference call 2 days later with Alina and her supervisor. They explained the realistic outcomes of going to trial versus accepting a plea deal. At trial, prosecutors would have to prove every element of every charge beyond reasonable doubt. Jerry's lawyer would attack my credibility and claim I was a willing participant who changed my mind. The jury might convict on some charges but acquit on others. The trial could take weeks, and I would have to testify multiple times and face cross-examination. With a plea deal, Jerry would admit guilt and go to prison for a guaranteed lengthy sentence. I wouldn't have to testify or face his lawyer's questions. The case would be resolved within months instead of dragging on for over a year. I appreciated Alina's honesty about the system's problems. She wasn't promising me perfect justice or pretending trial would be easy. She was giving me real information, so I could make an informed choice. I told them I wanted to hear the full plea terms before deciding anything. The negotiations continued over the next 2 weeks. Alina kept me updated on every development. The plea deal would include discussions of money payments for my therapy costs and lost wages from missing work. A lifetime no-contact order that would stay in effect even after Jerry got out of prison. His cooperation in identifying other people involved in the trafficking network. I insisted on one thing. I wanted to read a victim impact statement at sentencing regardless of whether there was a plea or trial. I needed to look Jerry in the face and tell him exactly what he did to me and how it affected my life. Alina made sure that was written into any agreement. She said the judge would allow it and nothing in the plea deal could take away my right to speak at sentencing. That guarantee made the idea of accepting a plea more bearable. I might not get my full day in court, but I would still get to confront him directly. Maggie helped me start drafting my victim impact statement during our therapy sessions. The process was harder than I expected. Putting my trauma into words on paper made it feel more real somehow. I wrote about the nightmares where I woke up convinced someone was breaking into my apartment. The way I jumped at unexpected sounds and couldn't relax even in supposedly safe places. How I had stopped trusting people because Jerry had used my trust to plan my kidnapping. The destroyed sense of safety that made even simple tasks like grocery shopping feel dangerous. But I also wrote about my choice to not let Jerry's actions define the rest of my life. About my work in therapy and my commitment to healing. About my anger at what he did, but also my hope for eventually moving forward. Maggie sat with me through multiple drafts and helped me find the right words to express things I had trouble articulating. The statement was painful to write, but also felt like I was taking back control of my own story. We practiced me reading the statement aloud in therapy sessions. The first time I tried, I broke down crying before finishing the second paragraph. My voice shook and I had to stop multiple times to catch my breath. The second attempt was slightly better, but I still couldn't get through it without stopping. By the third run-through, I made it halfway before the tears came. The fourth time I read it from start to finish with tears running down my face but without stopping. Maggie told me that was strength. Not the absence of tears, but the ability to speak my truth despite the pain. She reminded me that crying while confronting Jerry didn't make me weak. It made me human. I practiced 2 more times that week until I felt confident I could read it at sentencing without completely falling apart. The plea deal got finalized on a Tuesday morning. Jerry agreed to plead guilty to federal kidnapping and human trafficking conspiracy charges. The sentencing guidelines called for 15 to 25 years in federal prison. Alina called me right after the paperwork was signed to explain what it meant. Jerry would serve at least 85% of whatever sentence the judge imposed. With good behavior, he might get out slightly early, but he would be locked up well into his 50s at minimum. Part of me had wanted him to get life in prison. I wanted him to never walk free again. But Alina explained this was actually a strong outcome. Federal charges carried serious mandatory minimums, and the judge had discretion to go above the guidelines if the victim impact statement and evidence warranted it. Jerry would be an old man by the time he got out, and he would have a federal trafficking conviction on his record forever. That would follow him for the rest of his life. I thanked Alina for fighting for this outcome and told her I was ready for sentencing whenever it was scheduled. Sentencing day came 3 weeks later, and I spent an hour that morning picking out my outfit. I chose a navy blue suit that made me feel professional and strong, like armor against whatever happened in that courtroom. Mom drove up the night before and met me at my apartment, and Gareth arrived right on time to escort us both to the courthouse. We walked through the metal detectors and down the long hallway to the courtroom, and my legs felt shaky, but I kept moving forward. The courtroom was smaller than I expected, with wooden benches and fluorescent lights that buzzed slightly. We sat in the front row behind the prosecutor's table, and I watched the door where they would bring Jerry in. When the bailiff finally led him through the side entrance, I barely recognized him. The orange jumpsuit hung loose on his frame, and his hair was greasy and unkempt. He shuffled in with chains around his ankles and wrists, and when he glanced in my direction, his eyes darted away immediately. Seeing him like that, powerless and trapped, gave me a weird sense of satisfaction. He was the one in chains now instead of me. The judge entered, and everyone stood, and then we sat back down and the hearing began. Alina stood and explained the plea agreement to the judge, outlining each charge Jerry had admitted to and the sentencing guidelines. Then the judge looked directly at me and asked if I wanted to read my victim impact statement. My hands trembled as I stood and walked to the podium with my printed pages. I cleared my throat and started reading, my voice shaky at first but growing stronger with each sentence. I described how Jerry's betrayal destroyed my sense of safety in my own home, how I couldn't sleep without nightmares of being dragged away, how I jumped at every unexpected sound and struggled to trust anyone, how he had stolen my intimate photos and used them to sell me like property, violating me in ways I was still trying to process. I talked about the zip ties cutting into my wrists and the gag in my mouth, and the wedding veil he placed on my head like some sick joke. My voice cracked a few times, but I didn't stop reading. When I finished, I looked up at the judge and saw her nodding slowly. She thanked me for my courage in speaking and then turned to Jerry. Her voice was firm as she addressed him directly about the seriousness of his crimes. She said human trafficking was one of the most heinous offenses our legal system dealt with, and that his actions showed a complete disregard for another person's humanity. Then she announced the sentence. 22 years in federal prison with no possibility of parole before serving 85% of the time. Jerry would be nearly 60 years old before he could even think about getting out. I felt Mom grab my hand and squeeze it tight. Gareth leaned over and whispered that this was an excellent outcome, above the guidelines. As they led Jerry away in his chains, he finally looked at me one more time, and I stared right back without flinching. Over the next few weeks, Gareth kept me updated on Jerry's 3 accomplices, as they each accepted their own plea deals. The guy who grabbed my ankles and pulled me from under the bed got 15 years. The one who drove the van got 12 years. The third one who helped coordinate everything got 8 years since he cooperated more with the investigation. Knowing every single person involved was behind bars helped me breathe easier. The threat was actually over. They couldn't hurt me anymore. I returned to my apartment after staying away for nearly a month between Mom's house and the safe house. Walking through my front door felt strange, like entering a place that used to be mine but didn't quite feel like home anymore. I spent the entire first day deep cleaning every surface, scrubbing floors and wiping down walls and washing windows. Then I started rearranging furniture, moving my bed to a different wall and shifting my couch to face the door instead of away from it. The security system with its cameras and sensors gave me peace of mind every time I checked the app on my phone. I bought completely new bedding in different colors and replaced my curtains with thicker ones that blocked out more light. Every visual reminder of that night when Jerry had a key and walked right in needed to disappear. By the end of the day, the apartment felt more like mine again. My boss and I had a video call to discuss my return to work, and we created a gradual plan together. I would start with half days for the first week, then 3/4 days the second week, building back up to full-time by week 3. My coworkers were supportive when I came back, asking how I was doing but not pushing for details when I kept my answers brief. Having the routine and structure of work helped me feel normal again, like I was a functional person with a job and responsibilities instead of just a victim of a crime. The tasks and deadlines gave me something to focus on besides replaying everything that happened. The online harassment that had been constant for weeks finally started dying down as the news cycle moved on to other stories. I still got occasional random messages from people who had seen the coverage, strangers with opinions about what I should have done differently, or questions about details that were none of their business. But Maggie had taught me coping strategies for when those messages came through, and I got better at blocking and deleting them without spiraling into panic. The intrusions became less frequent as time passed. I met with a civil attorney to discuss the possibility of suing Jerry for damages beyond the criminal restitution order. She explained the process would be lengthy and expensive, requiring depositions and potentially another trial. She also pointed out that collecting money from someone in federal prison was extremely unlikely, and even if I won a judgment, it might be years before seeing any payment. After thinking about it for a few days, I decided to focus my energy on recovery instead of more legal battles. The criminal conviction and the restitution order felt like enough justice for now. I didn't want to spend more years of my life tied to Jerry through lawsuits. In therapy, Maggie and I talked about how I was still having PTSD symptoms even months after everything happened. The nightmares came less often, but they still came. Loud noises made me jump and my heart race. Sometimes I would be fine for days and then suddenly have a panic attack in the grocery store for no clear reason. Maggie helped me understand that healing wasn't a straight line. Some days would be better than others, and that was normal. She said trauma recovery could take years, and there was no timeline I needed to meet. I committed to continuing weekly therapy for at least another year, maybe longer if I needed it. Just knowing I was taking active steps to process everything made me feel less broken. Mom and I worked on establishing new routines that gave her peace of mind, without making me feel suffocated. We set up weekly video calls every Sunday evening where we could catch up and she could see my face and know I was okay. We also created a code word system, where she could text me a specific phrase, and I would respond with a different phrase to confirm I was safe. If I ever didn't respond within an hour, she would call Gareth or the police. This system helped her trust that I could take care of myself while still being available when I actually needed her. Our relationship felt healthier than it had in years, because we were communicating better about boundaries and needs. 3 months after sentencing, Maggie suggested we try an exposure therapy exercise. She wanted to drive out to the area near the private airport where everything had happened, but in daylight with a clear plan for leaving if I needed to. I was scared but agreed because I knew avoiding that place forever meant giving it power over me. We drove out there on a Saturday morning with the windows down and music playing. As we got closer to the spot, I felt my breathing speed up and my hands start shaking. Maggie reminded me to use my grounding techniques, naming things I could see and feel. We pulled over about a quarter mile from where the arrest happened and just sat there for 10 minutes. My heart pounded the entire time, but I managed to stay present in the moment instead of dissociating like I used to. We didn't get out of the car, but just being there and not falling apart felt like a victory. On the drive back, I felt proud of myself for facing that place instead of letting it haunt me forever. I was reclaiming my ability to exist in the world without constant fear. That weekend, I sat down at my laptop and started writing everything from the beginning. I typed out how Mom called me crying about Dubai, and how I found the fake wedding registry with my name on it. I described the dress delivery and finding the trafficking profile and Jerry's key turning in my lock. I wrote about the van ride and the airport, and Maxine's badge appearing when I thought I was being sold. The words poured out for hours as I documented every detail I could remember from the FBI interviews and the grand jury testimony and Jerry's sentencing. I saved the file with a password and backed it up to 3 different places, because this was my version of what happened, and I needed to control at least that part of my story. I didn't plan to post it anywhere or show it to anyone, but having it written down made me feel like I owned the narrative instead of just being a victim in everyone else's version of events. A week later, I met Gareth for coffee at a small cafe 2 blocks from the victim services office. He ordered his usual black coffee, and I got a latte, and we sat by the window where the afternoon sun came through the glass. He told me about a support group for trafficking survivors that met twice a month, and said I might find it helpful to talk with other people who understood what I'd been through. I told him I'd think about it because I wasn't sure I was ready to hear other people's stories when I was still processing my own. We talked about how recovery wasn't about going back to who I was before Jerry, but about building something new with everything I'd learned about myself and what I could survive. When I stood up to leave and walked out onto the sidewalk, the sunshine felt warm on my face, and I realized I felt cautiously optimistic that I was actually going to be okay.